Technically, it's almost 1:30 here, so we will start the program today. First of all, my name is Abdul Darar. I'm the City Environmental Compliance Manager. I've been working in the city now for 20 years plus, and I'm really pleased with the crowd here. This is good numbers here, so that's a good start to begin with. This is a joint effort here between the City of Manhattan Public Works Department and the Code Services Department of Code Services. And just kind of background, as most of you know, we started the City Grease Management Permit Program in March 2011. The program was implemented 2012, and for 5 years, after 5 years of running the program, we decided in 2007 to basically pause for a second here and evaluate the program. And we tried to listen to you. We had many separate meetings we had, and we got some feedback from the food service establishment, from the people who do the inspection. And in 2017, we started the process of revising the Grease Management Permit Program. And in October 17, the City Commission passed the ordinance revising the Grease Management Permit Program. All the revisions, which we'll be discussing details today, will be implemented in 2018. So with that here, I'm going to have our staff, city staff, introduce themselves. Brad here, Brad Clausen from the Code Services here, and we have Kevin Beckman. He's the environmental specialist. He's the person who actually runs the day operation of the program. And next to him is Tim Mangus, environmental specialist. He is also one of our staff, and he also helped with the program. With that said here, I'm gonna just kind of go over what we have in mind today. We're gonna have presentation for about an hour, and then hopefully the presentation will generate some questions, and we're gonna have question and answer session for about 30 minutes. And then we take the test. We'll allow 1 hour, but it's not going to take 1 hour here. That just going to make sure everybody understands. You can take notes, and we have all the slides. It is one of the handouts. You can write your notes and so forth. And we're going to give you some time to read your notes, but the exam is going to be closed book. We have 24 questions in the exam. You have to have 18 or more to pass the test. So you can miss up to 8 questions and you still pass the test. 75% success rate to pass the test. If for some reason you did not pass, I know you know the stuff. Some people have exam fright and they're not feeling comfortable taking exam. If you don't pass today, we're gonna give you another chance to take it. The material, you can take this with you, study the material. We're going to try to tape this presentation, will be taped, will be available on the website, and then we will have another chance for those who missed today, or for those who are here today and not passing the test, they will be a second chance. With that said here, I'll introduce Brad Clausen.
Thanks, Abdu. Good afternoon, everybody. That was pretty weak, wasn't it? Thanks. I'll try and keep this fairly brief. What I'm going to do is go through the provisions of Grease Interceptors from both the Plumbing Code and PDI G101, which is the Plumbing and Drainage Institute standard for Grease Interceptors. That's where all of my material comes from. I know we have lots of licensed plumbers here today. Some of what I'm going to talk about are installation type things, but from an inspection standpoint, I still thought it was good information for you all to have. If you're going to be out inspecting them, it's helpful to know what the requirements are to install the Grease Interceptor. So a couple of housekeeping things. Those of you that have plumbing or HVAC licenses, you can use this, at least my portion of this, for continuing education credits for your license. So remember to add that next year when you renew. One other thing, and I think this gets, I don't know if it's forgotten is the right word, but if you're out there installing grease interceptors, it's like any other piece of plumbing you're doing, it requires a plumbing permit. So, if you get a restaurant, let's say, that calls you and asks you to, these folks tell a restaurant they need a grease interceptor, and so they call you to install one. Don't forget to call us at Code Services. We need a permit, and we'll inspect it after it gets installed. So ask questions as you go. Most of you, a lot of you have been to one of my classes before. I probably like lots of questions if you have them. We'll try to answer them, and if we can't get you an answer, we'll find one. Okay, there's two types of grease interceptors we're going to talk about, and I'm kind of tied to this microphone. I like to wander around, but I can't today, so since Abdu said we're recording this. But there's two types of grease interceptors that the plumbing code recognizes. The first one is called a gravity-type grease interceptor. That's what you'd commonly hear people call them in-ground. They're the big tank types that go in the ground outside the establishments. They are typically at least 500 gallon, and they actually work by a process which allows that liquid to stay in that tank for a long enough duration for the grease to actually separate by gravity. The other type is the hydromechanical type. Most people would call those the under sink or under counter or above floor type. You hear all kinds of different terms for them, but the code term for it is hydromechanical type. And that's the type that you'd see, again, use a restaurant as an example. You'd see them under the counters, under the 3-bay sinks a lot of times. But those actually work on, they work on a gravity principle, but they also use air entrainment to separate that grease, and both the gravity and the hydromechanical types will have baffles in them that further help to get the grease separated. This is a gravity-type grease interceptor. You'll see, most common type you would see that are outside of big commercial food establishments typically. You'll see this one just has a single baffle wall in it. There's a manhole on each section of this for cleaning, maintenance, servicing, that sort of thing. An inflow and an outflow on them. And the baffle wall that's inside. These actually aren't very complicated. Again, they just work by allowing that liquid that flows in to sit in there long enough for that grease to separate before the liquid hits the outflow. Just a picture of a gravity-type grease interceptor. They can be pretty big. I mean, the minimum size, as I said, is 500 gallon. These can go well over 1,000 gallon or bigger if necessary. So they can be pretty big. Same sort of thing right there. You see the manhole covers on the top for the access to those for pumping, maintenance, cleaning, that sort of thing. So again, not too much to these really. They're fairly they're not rocket science. They're fairly simple pieces of equipment. And don't let me go too fast again. If there's something of this that you don't understand or you have a question, let me know. Raise your hand, or I'll have time when I'm done to answer questions. This would be a hydromechanical type. As you see there, we've got the flow control device. We'll talk about those a little bit more in a few minutes. You see the inlet baffles. There's an outlet baffle in this particular one. The solids would typically settle out at the bottom. The fats, oils, and grease would be separated and be at the top of the tank typically, and then you have your outlet section of that hydromechanical. They're typically anywhere between 15 and 60 gallon, 20 to 50 GPM flow rates, 40 and 100 pounds grease retention capacity. So they're not big. You can use either one of these that you want in an establishment. The gravity type have obviously a much greater grease retention capacity, so that's why you see those in places that generate a lot of grease, typically fast food restaurants. There's one at the mall, outside the mall, that serves the whole food court. So now there's nothing that says anywhere that you can't have a hydromechanical grease interceptor in conjunction with a gravity type. It may be, it just provides extra protection. So if there's a hydromechanical type inside, does not mean there won't be a gravity type outside, or vice versa. So don't just take it for granted when you see one of those that the other one doesn't exist on that property. It's certainly possible that they could have both types in an establishment. And I'll use the mall again as an example, because the individual restaurants in the food court, I think several of them have hydromechanical type, but then there's also a big gravity type that's outside in the yard. So questions on those two types? Pretty clear? Okay. This is just another hydromechanical type, and I threw this one in because I want you to, and those of you that have opened these and pumped them out and looked in them, you guys will all understand, or seen new ones that you've installed. Each manufacturer has a different way of manufacturing their grease traps, or grease, I shouldn't use the word grease trap, it's grease interceptors, but they have a different way of doing it to trap the grease. You see this one has some very unique baffles in it, and then there's a perforated screen in the middle that provides extra air entrainment as that liquid goes through there to help separate the grease. The point being, when you open these up to inspect them and they're pumped out, they're going to look different usually depending on the manufacturer. They're not always the same. In fact, from manufacturer to manufacturer, many times they're quite different. As you can see, if you look at this one and then that one, there's a pretty big difference in how those two are manufactured. Those baffles also can be removable, so you can pull those screens, baffles, whatever you want to call them, out of there to clean them in some cases. I think sometimes over the years when some of these hydromechanical types have been there quite a while and they've been opened, every once in a while you'll find that one of those baffles got removed and then somebody never put it back in again. Well, that's not going to be as effective now as it would be. It's not going to work the way it was designed. So you might check for that. It's interesting that PDI, which is the Plumbing and Drainage Institute, they have a test procedure before their label goes on any of these grease interceptors. They have a lab that they test these things in, and they have to pass a test where this device traps at least 93% of the grease that goes through them. That's quite a bit, if they run 100 pounds of grease through this interceptor, it needs to trap 97 pounds. 93, sorry. There's an allowance for 7% that it's not going to trap. So these things are not 100% effective. I don't think anybody would tell you that. But without them, and I'm sure these gentlemen from utilities would tell you, without these and without the gravity types, we have massive problems sometimes in the sewer system. So I threw this one in again, those of you that have worked with these would know, this is a typical label that will be on a hydromechanical grease interceptor. It'll have the flow rate in GPM on there, gallons per minute. It'll have the grease retention capacity in pounds, the inlet size, and there may be some other info, but when we're out inspecting these, that's some of the essential info that we're going to look for. So, and when I talk in a little bit about how we size these things, that information becomes pretty critical in that case. Just another hydromechanical, you'll see right there, it's the inlet and outlet are labeled, so make sure that whoever put this thing in, those of you that are inspecting these, make sure it was put in the right direction of flow. They work in one direction. They're not interchangeable. You can't flip them around. So make sure the inlet and the outlets are correct in the installation. Example of different sizes. Again, everywhere from small to pretty big on the hydromechanical ones. Again, the gravity ones can be many, many times bigger than these, but you can get whatever size of these you want within the range that they manufacture them. So it's all based on how much grease that establishment is going to generate that's going to go down the drain, and how often they want to clean those. Really, you can get by with a smaller grease interceptor if you want to clean it out more often. If you've got something that retains 60 pounds of grease, you're going to have to clean it a little less often than something that retains 40 pounds. One's a little bigger than the other. So, that's a choice that the establishment and the owner of the property have to make when they install these. But there's a minimum size, but certainly you can go bigger if you want to. Now, I said we were going to talk about the flow control device on these hydromechanical interceptors. This is required by the code, and in fact, the manufacturers of these hydromechanical interceptors also, almost all of them that I've seen, require a flow control device on the inlet side of the interceptor. It doesn't look like much. You see this one, there's different looks to different ones, but this one, when it's installed, is not much more than looks like a coupling in the pipe with a vent opening at the top. But what that does, it controls the flow of the liquid into that interceptor so that you don't wind up with an overflow or excess amount of flow in that interceptor. That flow control device should go with that particular interceptor. You can't just use any old flow control device with any grease interceptor. It's got to be, the two go together because there's a certain amount of flow based on the size of the interceptor. So those are required. Make sure those go on the inlet side of the interceptors. And as you're inspecting them, there should be on the inlet side. If you see a hydromechanical grease interceptor that does not have a flow control device, I would question that. It could have gotten installed with that one. It could be somebody replumbed something and it got removed. It's hard to tell what happens to those over the years as those things set in those establishments. So that flow control device has to be vented. It doesn't have to be vented necessarily directly out of that device. It could be vented immediately after it, but it's got to be vented, and that vent's got to terminate not less than 6 inches above the flood rim of the fixture it serves. Now, I say that, and I have to make sure that you're clear on what I mean by that. I don't mean that you just, although you could, in certain cases, if you're using your grease interceptor as a fixture trap, which you can do, if you have a grease interceptor and it's within 30 inches of your fixture that it's serving, you can actually use that as the fixture trap and not have to install a trap at the fixture. That would become useful where you have indirect wasted 3-compartment sinks, for instance, and you don't want to install a trap at that sink. You can actually use the grease interceptor as your fixture trap. If you do that, yes, you can just terminate that vent above the flood rim of the fixture because your trap downstream is actually what's trapping your sewer gas. Otherwise, though, the vent from those should typically go should be vented outside on its own, or you can take it up and tie it back into the system plumbing vent if you want. There's probably a more common way to do it. The reason that the 6 inches above the flood rim of the fixture is that if your grease interceptor becomes clogged, we don't want something to back up out of that. If you get a fixture that's higher than the termination of your vent, grease trap's clogged, you could wind up with a backup out of that vent pipe. So flow control device required, vented, either 6 inches above or tie it back into your plumbing vent system, one of the two. Again, if you're just inspecting these, not installing them, again, just make sure that they have flow controls and then they're vented. So questions on that? Okay. Here's just kind of a standard setup, really. Kind of shows what I've been talking about so far. You've got your flow control, your vent for that flow control, your hydromechanical interceptor, and into the waste line. So generally, in this case, we'd probably see that vent go back over and tie into that waste vent over there, but that's in very simple terms really what one of these installations should look like. You know, we get the question, code gets this question, I think utilities gets it once in a while too. How often do you have to clean one of these things out? Well, there's nowhere does it say you have to clean it out. I think there is something in our ordinance now that says that, but you know, how often you clean them really is also based on how much greasy waste goes down them really. You know, the more you pour or wash down that drain, the more often you have to clean them to get them to work effectively. It's also worth noting probably when you open that interceptor up to look in it, to inspect it, you know, look for obstructions in the inlet pipe, in the outlet pipe, maybe in the baffles, anywhere that things can get stuck, because as we all know, you get solids materials that gets, you know, washed down the drain, whether it be food chunks or whatever else, you know, and those things can wind up clogging those inlet and outlet pipes or parts of the interior of that interceptor. So another thing to check as you're looking inside those, that all of the pipes and screens, baffles, all of that are clear of debris. Now, threw this one in because this is not a different type of grease removal device, but it's a variation of the hydromechanical type. It's called an automatic grease removal device. And what it is, it's a hydromechanical interceptor that has an automatic internal means of removing the grease. Usually it's some kind of skimmer that's in there, and it will actually skim the grease into an external container. Here's a picture of what one might look like. Again, you'll see them, you know, installed in the same locations as you would any other hydromechanical, but they essentially are just collecting the grease in an external container that winds up having to get emptied on some kind of regular basis whenever it fills up. So, you know, with these, there's not a ton of difference, with the exception of that automatic skimmer device in there that skims that grease off and pumps it to that container. This may be the single biggest question we get from everybody, you know, at least at the code office. Where do I have to put a grease interceptor? Well, the code requires them anywhere, basically anywhere that you're going to have grease-laden waste, okay? It excludes dwelling units and single-family dwellings, so apartments and houses and things aren't required to install grease interceptors. But pretty much anywhere else that has a kitchen that might generate grease-laden waste, if it's commercial, it's probably going to be required to have a grease interceptor of some type. Not all, but most of the time. The kinds of fixtures that we would see that would wind up going into the grease interceptor, I took this wording right out of the code. Pot sinks, pre-rinse sinks, soup kettles, woks, floor drains, or sinks into which anything's drained from the kitchen, auto hood wash units, and dishwashers without pre-rinse sinks. So we get that question a lot. Do I have to connect the commercial dishwasher to the grease trap? depends if it has a pre-rinse sink or not before the dishes go in the dishwasher. So if it does not have a pre-rinse, then you do need to run it through the Grease Interceptor. You don't. Now, where is it not required? Again, as I said, Grease Interceptors are not required in individual dwelling units or private living quarters, so houses, duplexes, apartment buildings, all that sort of thing, they're not required in. Also, you know, I think people sometimes get the idea that, well, we'll just run everything through the Grease Interceptor, that way we'll be sure to catch everything, right? And that's not really a good idea, because the code actually says fixtures that don't contain greasy waste shall not be routed through the interceptor. The reason for that is because if you have too much flow through that interceptor, it's going to reduce its effectiveness. You want just the right amount of flow in there to trap that grease, and anything in excess of that may wind up washing some of that grease through that interceptor if you have excess flow. Other things, water closets, of course, bathroom fixtures, hand sinks, lavatories, things like that, we don't want to see going through the interceptor. So, you know, what goes through there just needs to be the fixtures that are going to potentially generate the grease, fats, and oils. So. Food waste grinders, garbage disposals, we'll want those to go through the Grease Interceptor, but they're required to have a strainer at the fixture. So make sure those have a strainer or solids interceptor at the garbage disposal or food waste interceptor. I'll skim through this a little bit because it's really not really related to inspecting these, which is the purpose of this whole class. But I did want, especially for the plumbers in here who might be installing these, I wanted you to be aware of how these things are sized. You know, when somebody comes to us and says, hey, so-and-so hired me to put a Grease Interceptor in, how big do you want it? Well, there's really not that much to it. PDI, the G101 standard, actually has a couple of different ways you can size hydromechanical Grease Interceptors. The first one of those, and the one I like to use that's about as simple as it gets, PDI has this table in there, and it essentially strictly works off of the size of the inlet pipe for the hydromechanical Grease Interceptor. So if you have a 2-inch or less inlet to this Grease Interceptor, you want a Grease Interceptor that's a 20 GPM. Now, that number comes from the maximum full flow of a 2-inch pipe. A 2-inch pipe, unless it's got a whole bunch of head pressure to it, is going to flow probably a little under, I think if you calculate it, it's about 19.5 GPMs. So what it's doing is that Grease Interceptor is being sized for the maximum flow that you could get out of the size of pipe that's connected to your inlet. In a second here, I'll talk about the grease retention capacity, but the other part of sizing Grease Interceptors is a GPM and a grease retention capacity. The grease retention capacity on these, I have found, is typically twice the flow rate. So for a 20 GPM hydromechanical Grease Interceptor, the grease retention capacity is going to be 40 pounds. For a 60 GPM, it's going to be 120 pounds grease retention capacity. So you'll see that when you look on the labels of these interceptors that you just double the flow-through rate, and that's the grease retention capacity. Questions on that? That's the easy way. You know, somebody calls and says, I'm going to put one of these in. Well, what's your inlet size? 1.5 inch, 2 inch? Okay, use a 20 GPM, you know. You want to go bigger, you can, but just don't go smaller than that. Here's the other way, and I'm not even going to start explaining this one, but basically what you do is you calculate the volume of every fixture that's connected to that interceptor, and then you use that amount of liquid capacity and make sure that your flow rate is equal to what's actually connected to it. To me, you can use this if you want. If you want to get a copy of PDI G101, it's free. You just go to the PDI's website, and I downloaded a copy a long time ago and just printed it off and put it in my code book. So if you guys want a copy of that, simple as going to their website and printing it off. PDI G101, testing and rating procedures for hydromechanical grease interceptors. So I would suggest that you all get that if you're going to be doing this. It would be helpful, especially if you're installing them. It's really helpful in that respect. So, grease retention capacity, as I said, is at double the flow rate. So, if you're looking for a 40-pound grease retention capacity, you know you're going to need a 20 GPM hydromechanical grease interceptor. Now, gravity grease interceptor sizing is a little bit different. It's based on making sure that that liquid's going to stay in that tank long enough for that grease to rise by gravity. So what it's assuming is a 30-minute retention time. So it's really all you're doing is making sure that the amount of liquid, the max amount that's going to flow into there, will stay in there for at least 30 minutes before it exits the tank. So in the case of I just use this as an example. If you had a 2-inch inflow on a gravity grease interceptor, the flow rate of a 2-inch pipe is 19.44 GPMs times 30 minutes. You need a 583-gallon interceptor. As I said, they can get pretty big. And I don't know that it's worth worrying about this much, because almost always when these gravity interceptors are installed, they're engineered. So you guys are installing them based on what's shown on a set of construction plans. The project engineer for a restaurant will specify the particular size of gravity interceptor they want installed based on the fixtures that are flowing through it. So again, probably not worth worrying about this too much, but it's handy info just to know how those get sized. So that's really as much as I can tell you about grease interceptors, probably as much as you really wanted to know. But questions, anybody, on any of that? Again, it's not really a terribly complicated subject, really, if you just kind of understand how they work. So that if you are inspecting, if you know how they work and how they're supposed to be installed, then you can typically take a look and make sure that that those criteria are met. So, any questions from anybody? You guys aren't normally this quiet, so I'm looking for any questions you got. Nothing. Okay, well, good enough. I'll expect 100% on the test then, right? Thanks. I appreciate you guys listening to me today.
Thank you, Brad. Good job. For those of you who came late, please make sure you sign your name in the attendance list. And also there is the 4 handouts. Make sure you have one of each.
Did everybody get a handout? Did we make enough? Okay. As I said, I'm Kevin. I'm kind of the one that oversees the program. And my talk is going to be about program requirements themselves. I can get this thing working. to run the machine, which I obviously don't. So as I said, I'm just going to talk about the program requirements today. The primary objective of the Grease Management Permit Program is to monitor and reduce the quantity of grease-laden waste discharged to the sanitary sewer collection system by food service establishments. And of course, food service establishments can be anything from restaurants, schools, hospitals, churches, daycares, food industries, which I don't believe we have any contributing in Manhattan, cafeterias, nursing and retirement homes, residential halls, and not all restaurants are permitted under the program. There are a few in town that are considered non-discharging. That is based on how the food is prepared, if it comes prepackaged, what amount of preparation that they do and everything. Some background for the program. As Abdu mentioned earlier, the first ordinance was passed in March of 2011, kicked off in January of 2012, and the whole thing kind of began with the state and EPA directive to reduce sanitary sewer overflows that result in sewer discharges to the environment. As I said, it was first adopted in March of 2011, implemented in 2012. The basics of the first ordinance were to reinforce existing plumbing code requirements for grease removal devices. The plumbing code at the time, and still, requires them in certain applications, but after that there was no requirements for maintenance or anything like that. We got reports of, after the inspection, places would remove them so they didn't have to mess with them, stuff like that. So that was one of the things that we wanted to address with the program. Also to permit all FSEs that produce grease-laden waste. And the permit was more of a vehicle for tracking what was out there, and what kind of service was being done to it. We required annual inspections by city licensed plumber to ensure proper operation and functionality. There was the annual permit of $25, which, the program doesn't pay for itself by any stretch of the imagination, but so anyway, that's that. Enforcement and fines for non-compliance and failures to submit inspection documents or for non-renewal of the permits. And as Brad said, it only applies to non-residential sewer customers. So houses, apartment buildings, whatnot, didn't fall under the purview of this program. And some of the consequences of grease-laden waste in the sewer system, and you guys know this more than anybody else, stoppages, backups, sanitary sewer overflows resulting in human health and welfare issues if you get sewage in a building or anywhere where it could come into contact with people. And of course, who does it impact? Mostly it's the FSE that hasn't been doing the maintenance. They're the first place to experience the overflow because most blockages occur first in the lateral lines before it gets to the sewer main. Increased maintenance to the sewer system, costs to the city for removal of grease from sewer mains, lift stations, the treatment plant, and then hauling and disposal of those materials to the Topeka landfill. And since this the program first went into effect, Topeka has quit accepting that kind of waste. So it's kind of really become an issue for us. Some statistics of the program from 2012 to 2017, just the number of FSEs and the number of permits. you can see it's increased steadily over the years to this past year when we had almost 180 establishments permitted. And as Abdu said, since this was kind of the 5-year anniversary of the program, we did a review, looked at what did work, what didn't work, what our complaints were, got input from the food service establishments and from you guys. And the first iteration of the program was just a bare minimum of requirements, and it was lacking. The renewal process could be confusing for FSEs. And the most confusing part was that there was 2 dates. There was the permit renewal date and the inspection date. And when the program first started, most FSEs would get their inspection around renewal time, towards the end of the year. And then throughout the years, some places would get them early, some places would get them late, until the inspections were strung out all throughout the year and didn't have any tie with the expiration date, and people would get confused. We'd send them a notice of violation for not doing their inspection, and they say, no, my inspection isn't due until December the 31st, and there was just a lot of confusion. Consistent failure by numerous FSEs to comply in a timely manner. The permits expired on December the 31st. We gave them a 30-day grace period before we doubled the permit fee to a whopping $50. Every year we'd get 80% compliance by the end of January, and then we'd have to, chase all the rest of them around to try to get them to do their stuff. Inspection requirements were inadequate. We didn't require the grease removal device to be empty, which, you can gain some perspective by looking in a grease trap full of greasy water, but, really you can't see anything in there. You guys know better than anybody. There was no requirement to keep any maintenance records, minimal accountability to ensure proper management, and stuff like that. And this is just an illustration of the confusion with the 2 dates. So Buffalo Wild Wings here, the expiration date of their permit, of course, like everybody else in town, was 12/31. But they'd gotten on the ball one year and got it done early, and so their inspection was due in June. So that's a 6-month offset. And so, kind of our goal for this new ordinance was to help do away with some of that. Our new permit renewal process starting this year, and I don't know if you've heard all this or not, but we did an alphabetical permit renewal system, which is it's kind of like how you get your license plates, where A and B have to get their license plates in January, C and D in February, and so forth. And so this is to kind of help spread the workload out, instead of everybody getting slammed at the end of the year about, I need my grease trap cleaned out, I need an inspection, and that kind of thing. And we all know that the end of the year is a busy time anyway. Annual inspection is still required, but the due date is aligned with the permit expiration date. For an inspection to be valid for permit renewal, it must be done within 60 days before the expiration date of the permit. So for like Applebee's, for example, their permit renewal date is going to be January the 31st, since, of course, they start with A. Their permit or their inspection expiration date is also going to be January the 31st. And then there's a 60-day window in there for them to get their inspection done for it to be considered valid. So from the 1st of December till the end of January, anytime in that 60 days. And the grease removal device must be empty at the time of inspection. Because you guys need to see what's going on in there. The FSE must submit a copy of the maintenance log showing pumpings and inspections for the past year. And we have a new requirement this year that food service establishments get their grease trap cleaned out every 180 days. So ideally, when they submit a copy of their maintenance log, it should show a cleaning and an inspection within those 60 days prior to their inspection or to their expiration date, and then there should also be a cleaning 6 months before that. And then the permit fee remained $25, but we waived it for 2018 because everybody's schedule is going to be messed up. And, it wasn't fair to the food service establishments because, like Applebee's, since they had to renew in January, they would, pay just like they had every other year. But yet, like Zucky Bowl, I know they're not in business anymore, but Zucky Bowl would get a whole year before they had to pay. So we just waived that permit fee for everybody. And this is a graph about how the permit renewals fell in the old system, where the permits all expired on December the 31st, and you can see, it kind of September, October, November kind of just bumped along there, and then wham, in December we had all these renewals, and then January and February and then March, kind of trailed off there at the end. So with the new system, I know it's not, perfectly, even across there, but it at least helps somewhat. So this is, how the renewals are going to break down. As I said, there's a mandatory maintenance interval of 180 days. The old requirement was that the Grease Interceptors shall be maintained to ensure they operate continually, effectively, and as designed, which, really doesn't say anything. There's the industry standard for maintenance intervals, which is the 25% rule, where they need to be emptied when 25% of the volume is filled with grease and solids. Of course, that requires a lot of measuring, and we don't have the staff to do that. And like Brad said, the proper maintenance frequency is ultimately dependent on the amount of waste that goes through that thing. So even though it has to be, it has to be cleaned out every 6 months, that's not saying that that's sufficient. And if they need to clean it out once a month, then so be it.